Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. I'm Paul Shari. I'm a Senior Fellow and Director of the Future of Warfare Initiative here at CNAS. You got me okay on the audio? Okay. We're recording, so I want to make sure the audio's picking us up fine. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I also want to thank those of us joining us online on Facebook and at cnas.org/live. We'll be live streaming this. Feel free to join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtag #InnovateTheForce. And for those online, we'll be taking questions from Twitter later when we get to the Q&A portion. I'm very pleased today to announce a new project that CNAS is launching called Evolving the Future Force. It's been a multi-year effort looking at how we're seeing the Joint Force evolve in response to adversary innovation across the spectrum of conflict. Anything from non-state actors using cheap, commercially available drones to attack military forces to sophisticated nation states. And how should we respond to that, particularly in an area of great uncertainty, rapid technological change, a time period when a lot of technology innovation is very diffuse. It's happening in ways that proliferate rapidly around the globe, and also a lot of innovation outside of traditional defense sectors. And how should DoD respond to that? Now, we've got a great lineup of people here to talk about this from a variety of backgrounds. Dr. Bernadette Johnson from DIUX up at Cambridge, where she is the chief scientist there, and formerly chief technology officer at MIT Lincoln Labs. Colonel Mark Koppelman, currently at the Army War College, extensive experience as an Army Special Operations aviator, and of course extensive operational experience overseas. And he's been working at the Army War College thinking about risk, uncertainty, and options and acquisitions. And Dr. Reggie Brothers, currently a principal at the Chertoff Group, and former DASD for research in DoD, and former Undersecretary for Science and Technology at DHS. So we've got a great lineup of different perspectives. What we'll do is kind of discuss a little bit amongst some of our experts, get their thoughts, and then open it up midway to Q&A from folks from the group. So I wanted to start with you, Dr. Johnson. DIUX was created as kind of a way to expand how DoD is thinking about innovation. You've also got experience at MIT Lincoln Labs, doing some great work there. You know, based on your career and some of these organizations you've worked at, how do you think about what makes an organization innovative?
Well, thanks, Paul, for that completely unexpected question. You know, I thought I might answer by trying to run through a definition of innovation, but I'm going to defer to former Justice Stewart's definition of pornography, which is I'll know it when I see it. Bottom line is, it's something we all feel we want more of. We think we can buy it or perhaps train ourselves into it. I'm going to posit that we are all innovative when we have to be and if we're allowed to be. And so those are really two major themes that run through my mind when I talk about an innovative organization. So what do I mean when I have to be? You have to have a problem to solve. It's very difficult to be innovative in a vacuum, and it's very difficult to be innovative absent any kind of incentivization, bless you. You have to have a problem to solve and preferably some constraints. So I'm sure there are people who innovate out of boredom, but imagine you have a problem and you are told, for example, you have a launch date. You have a payload. You're designing. It's got to be on the satellite, which has got to be on the platform, which is launched on X date. There is nothing more inspiring of the creative juices flowing than a deadline. Another type of constraint is monetary, right? You have a problem, $10 million will solve it. You have a $2 million budget. What do you do? Those are the things and the reasons that we start looking at new solutions or alternate solutions. And probably my favorite form of constraint is resource. So how many, and I'm looking out there, some of you may remember Apollo 13. Remember 3 astronauts, 4 days in a capsule that had enough CO2 scrubbing for 2 astronauts, 2 days. So there the problem was real, it was critical, there was a time element, and it had to be solved with the resources at hand. And whether you solve a problem in space, on the space station, or you're in a ship or a forward operating base, we often face these kind of problems. We have something that is time critical and we only have the resources at hand. So I'll hypothesize that that's one of the ingredients that really drives us to be innovative. But if that's all we need, we wouldn't be having this meeting, right? Because we got plenty of hard problems to solve with lots of real constraints. The other half of this is that we have to have the freedom. And by that I mean we have to enable and empower our workforce to try solutions to exploit these innovative tendencies that they probably already have. I really do believe that innovation for most of us is quite natural. We do it as children, we explore the world. It's invigorating to try new things, and it's very rewarding and fulfilling when they work. But it's okay when they don't work. And if there's one thing that I have observed both in a research background as well as at DIUX now, which is the right to experiment and to try is one of the best ingredients in the innovative recipe that I can really suggest. So I don't have too many more things. We can talk a little bit about DIUX in particular during the Q&A, but I wanted to really throw out to the crowd that with those two ingredients, we already have an awful lot of what we need. We shouldn't look for it as something that we have to train ourselves into. I'll close with one quote that I read recently, and I apologize, I don't remember the reference, but I'll find out, that said, innovation is not really a matter of rote knowledge, but of a trained imagination. So I'm not sure what the training is, but I love the phrase. So, thanks.
Thanks. Colonel Koppelman, you've been thinking in some of your work at the Army War College about risk and uncertainty and how we manage that in acquisitions. I wonder if you could give us your thoughts on kind of what some of your thoughts are on how we can be more responsive to an uncertain future.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. The task that we were given up at the Army War College as a small group within the Carlisle Scholars Program was really to look at a new way of thinking about modernization. The three problems that we somewhat started with were, limited competition, which is in the early stages of acquisition. But during the acquisition, during the heart of it is requirements creep. And then at the end of it, when we have the capability delivered to the force, the last problem is fielding mismatch, right? Where the system may meet the requirements as they started out years or decades before, but may not be what we really need when it hits the force. As we looked at these three problems, and you talk about risk, and I'll paraphrase Secretary Gates, but I think it was Secretary Gates who said, and he was probably parroting several other people, that we have a perfect track record at predicting the next conflict, right? We are always wrong. And so given that fact, there is a lot of risk inherent in modernization, and are we going to acquire the right systems, the right weapons, the right equipment? So one of the things that we drew upon was a piece by a gentleman named Timothy Luhrmann, who wrote Strategy as a Portfolio of Real Options. And in Luhrmann's piece, his portfolio that he laid out was a tomato garden, was an example that he gave. And the garden along the x-axis was value to cost, and volatility along the y-axis. So what we did is we looked at the modernization options available to the Department of Defense. And the way we looked at those options were full fielding, limited fielding, prototyping, research and engineering, and then lastly is do nothing, right? And the do nothing can either be just completely letting the option expire, or if it's a low value at the time, high risk item, maybe let the private sector develop it, and then we see where the private sector goes with it, and if it becomes worthwhile for us to pursue it in the future. When we overlaid those five options onto Luhrmann's thought process, how he looked at real options, a couple things became clear to us, and that was full fielding would actually become something that we do less of in the Department of Defense, and really limited fielding would become the default position, where right now I think we could make a successful argument that the way we do acquisition is we jump in with both feet, and full fielding is the default. Primarily probably to be able to distribute RDT&E costs across a large purchase, right, to bring the per unit cost down. And obviously that would be something we'd have to overcome with limited fielding as the cost per unit would go up. But the problem and where it gets into modernization risk is due to Secretary Gates' quote and the fact that we know we probably won't be able to predict the next significant conflict. The problem with full fielding is we can't afford now to be wrong in the future. We will have spent so much money doing a full fielding that we will have mortgaged our ability to produce multiple options as the signals emerge, as technologies change, as adversaries and competitors emerge and change, and then be able to respond to that if we don't have a whole series of options on the shelf from which to pull. So the last thing I'll summarize just this answer with was a different Secretary of Defense and a quote that became somewhat infamous, and that was Secretary Rumsfeld when he was asked on the ground in Iraq about the Army, and he responded with, "You go to war with the Army you have, not the Army you want." And he was somewhat vilified for that due to perceived insensitivity in the crowd that he was addressing. However, Secretary Rumsfeld was correct. We go to war with the Army we have, not the Army we want. But if we develop an entire portfolio of real options, what we would essentially do is we would decrease the amount of time that it takes between the Army we have today and the Army we want, or that becomes apparent that we need in the future.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Brothers, you've been in positions of government where you've had to make these kinds of decisions about where do you invest, how does government draw in technology, what does make government investments versus piggyback off the private sector.
Sure.
How do you think about managing risk and uncertainty in an era of rapid change?
Yes, interesting question. So one of the challenges, as you mentioned, I was had oversight of the DoD research and also DHS research. And one of the big challenges I ran into is because, particularly when you look at DHS, let's use that for an example. You've got this enormous portfolio of mission sets, right? Anywhere from the Coast Guard to TSA to Customs and Border Protection, Secret Service, etc., right? And so my budget when I was at DHS was about $1 billion for RDT&A. Sounds like a big number. Compared to DoD, it's not a very big number, right? In fact, it's about an order of magnitude less, but you get this huge mission set. So the question you have to ask yourself is, so how do I figure out what do I actually want to invest in? And who do I want to invest those dollars in? I think the challenge I ran into then was, I can invest across all these different mission domains with a small amount of dollars, or I can invest a lot more money in a few number of domains. So how do you figure that out? And I think that took us a couple of years to actually figure out. The way we did this is we created something called integrated product teams. And these integrated product teams were pretty much a consortium of leadership across the department to come up with ways to come up with actually what they thought the most important set of missions were, and more so than that, what the most important capability gaps were. And we agreed upon this as a department. Then after agreeing upon that as a department, we then figured out, so what are the most important eigen technologies, if you will, right? What are the cross-cutting technologies that go across all of those particular capability gaps? And let's spend money on those things. The other thing we tried to do was try to figure out what's the right organizational structure. So I went back to some of my industry experience. And if you look at some of the large corporate structures, what you find is there's a central research facility. A lot of them have a central research facility that will look at kind of cross-cutting technologies. Then the business units, they'll each have their own independent research and development funds, IRAD funds, but they're more market-facing. And the companies that do it well, and actually when I was at DoD, I actually had a chance to visit a lot of these companies, the ones that do it well manage to cycle the people in the central research facility to the market-facing research facilities. Why do they do that? They do that so there's a constant exchange of knowledge, right? The scientists in the central place start understanding what the market-facing dynamics are. The folks in market-facing dynamics areas start understanding what the art of the possible is. The other piece I think is important is, if I had a conversation with Andy earlier about it, Andy's right there. I had a conversation with Andy earlier about this. One of the big challenges, I think, is getting scientists and engineers familiar with what the warfighters in a DoD sense or law enforcement in DHS sense really do, right? Because you were mentioning innovation. For me, innovation has to do with inventions that actually lead to a positive outcome, whether it's revenue or capability, stuff like that. And there are many examples I could cite, we could talk about them, where well-meaning scientists and engineers have come up with things that just plain don't work, right? Just plain. Here's an example, right? Forgive me for a second. So I was asked to go out to Camp Roberts, and there was a ranger squad out there. And this was a number of years ago. This is before all the ruggedized iPads and things like that. But it was essentially a ruggedized iPad. And the engineers had called me. They said, Dr. Brothers, you should go out there. You'll love this, right? We got this ruggedized thing. They can get Blue Force tracking. This is just great. I said, yeah, it sounds pretty cool. So I went out there and met with the squad leader. And this guy was angry. He was angry at this thing. Like, why are you angry? Because there's great tech, right? He was angry because, number one, Rangers wear gloves. Capacitive touchscreen is useless with the gloves. You could use a stylus, but if you're carrying a weapon and a tablet, you can't really hold a stylus as well. So that's pretty useless. In the daytime, what happens? Washed out. At nighttime, what happens?
Right.
Gives away your position, right? So what value is this? Zero. But the engineers had a great idea. The problem was they didn't know how these guys did their jobs. So there's this whole field of innovation called user-producer innovation, right? And this whole field is all about how do you get the users of a particular product involved with developers in real time. And my argument is that's a great way to efficiently do innovation when you get the users and producers actually involved. If you look at the literature, I'll stop here. If you look at the literature, what it says is user-producer innovation actually gives you an efficient way to do that, but you end up with what? The innovator's dilemma, right? So now you get the Henry Ford problem where if you ask people what they want a faster horse, right? So the way you get around that is you now have so-called wide aperture search, which is where you get to things like DIUX and the DHS Silicon Valley Innovation Program, where you start looking more broadly in terms of what's out there from both the commercial and a government-funded kind of innovation perspective.
Thanks. So true story. I was probably not at the same time, but I was in a Ranger squad out of Camp Roberts dealing with things like that.
Were you?
And
Yeah.
Similarly frustrating. Probably not the same squad, but yes.
Yeah.
So I want to ask each of you a question about the time dimension in thinking about innovation. One of the challenges we dealt with over the last 15 years of conflict is having institutions that are responsive enough to the pace of change on the battlefield and then the pace of change in technology. How do we become more agile in our institutions to be able to shorten these timelines, particularly when some major DoD assets we buy, we're going to keep for decades. And some of them we should. If we buy a ship or a tank or an aircraft, we know we want to keep that for long periods of time. But how do we also think about moving faster and then being able to upgrade things?
So I think one of the ways we can move faster in this general process is to look and see what's already developed. Maybe, in fact, we have things on the commercial marketplace, and this is kind of the motivation behind the DIUX and similar initiatives, is what's out there now that is already almost what we want, perhaps exactly what we want. So that's one way that we can transition things that are capable directly or more rapidly into the hands of the warfighter. Another is understanding that we don't have to have the 100% solution every time we try to procure something or address some particular capability gap. If we are willing to address a capability gap that will meet most of our needs right now, we can either evolve a better one and take a little time, or know that these things are all going to be obsolete anyway in a few years. Again, perhaps not ships, but an awful lot of the tech we use doesn't need to last as long as we sometimes spec it to last. So an upfront, perhaps management of our own expectations would be one way we can just start accelerating a bit.
When we looked at it, Paul, one of the things that we would frequently come back to is that in DoD modernization, time is really the dominant variable. There's a war that we may fight within the next 3 to 5 years, but there's a war that we will fight in the next 20, right? And so that gets into the balance that the Chief of Staff talks about frequently between readiness and modernization and where we choose to spend our capital. Real options is part of that answer, and I already kind of spoke on that in my previous answer. But the second part of that strategy, as we looked at it, was something that we called controlling the clock. And I think there's a lot that we can learn. We used, Elon Musk and Tesla as a kind of a case study example to where, Elon Musk views the factory as a product, right? Because the process of producing an automobile has been gone over so many times. The efficiencies to be gained there were minimal, but the efficiencies to be gained in the factory, were great. I think there's things with the miniaturization of manufacturing, automation of manufacturing, additive manufacturing, that are all ways that the Department of Defense can not just speed it up, but by shrinking it down, also can reduce the logistical tail, can move factories forward if needed, reducing the time to get the products to the warfighter. There's probably other ways in terms of the time element as well. There will be a signal at some point that we need a capability that we don't have. There are two things that then kind of come from that. One is, how much time does it take us as a nation to acquire the capability that we need? And then the second one is, what are the consequences of not having that capability, when we need it? Ultimately, it would be nice if the signal was such that we still had time before open conflict, came to be, that we could adapt the way we think. you could probably make the argument that the DF-21 or the DF-26 are signals that maybe we should rethink the way we organize our surface fleet right within the United States Navy today. Maybe the DF-26 may be to the carrier what Billy Mitchell was to the battleship, right? So, but like I said, there's that consequence, and that's really where so real options speaks to the time, how quickly we can pull these ideas off the shelf that we've been developing, and then second, controlling the clock. How can we mitigate that risk to force, risk to the nation in the interim while we don't have that capability?
So let's talk about two different things. Let's talk about agility of process and the agility of thought. Right? I think one of the challenges that we have, so if you look at, I put a lot of time at DHS in the Silicon Valley program, which is similar to DIUX. And the challenge we ran into there, and this gets into this wide aperture search I was talking about, is how do you first of all let people know what your problems are, right? That's one challenge, right? And I think this goes across the S&T ecosystem, whether you're talking to universities, whether you're talking to industry, FFRDCs, small companies, what have you. How does the government tell these organizations what the real challenges are? And there are contracting officers and lawyers that can get in the way of that, right? Because they say, because of competitive concerns, you can't talk to them and these kinds of things. So that's a problem. So let's say you get through that. You can tell people what your real problems are. All right. What's the next problem? The next problem is how do you get money to them? Right? How do you do a fast solicitation? How do you do a solicitation that's not this enormous management volume and technical volume? Because these smaller companies can't deal with that. How do you get funding to them at a time cost that really makes sense to their investors? There are ways. I mean, we did it, right? I mean, DIUX does it using versions of other transaction authority. We did the same thing at DUX using the same vehicle. The challenge you run into is how many of the legal community, the folks in the government on the legal side and the contracting side, understand how to do these things and feel comfortable with the risk that they can actually use these vehicles, because they're not necessarily trained on these vehicles, right? There are other transactions kinds of things. So the first issue, I think, and then the last problem that I see with the process is, let's say, for example, you do get rapid prototyping. Right? We're talking rapid prototyping. Then what? So let's say you do limited fielding, and then you also supplement that with rapid prototyping. What happens to prototype? How does that get in the acquisition process? Now, this I don't have an answer for. Right? How do you get that in the acquisition process? Because now you might have a really interesting solution, but you don't have a way to get it into the 2 to 4 year POM cycle, right, that the services have. So it's a process problem. So the second piece is agility of thought. I was out in Silicon Valley, and NASDAQ opened up an office there, I don't know, a couple years ago. And I was invited to go to the opening. And a friend of mine had said, whenever he'd gone out to, he was actually VC from Chicago. And he said the reason why he didn't like some of the stuff you see in Silicon Valley was because groupthink. And I said, really? He said, yeah. So let me do an experiment. So at this happy hour, I just started asking the VCs, what do you think are the most promising, interesting technologies? There were 3 things everybody said. Cloud, data analytics, machine learning. Like, okay, got it. But everybody said the same thing. Now, what if you go to these different publications that say, what are the emerging trends? What do you see? Everybody says the same thing, right? The same stuff. What about the publications that say, these are the real scary kinds of technologies that are coming up? The same stuff. But do you believe that? We're all saying the same thing? So that bothers me. It's like, wait a minute, why are we all saying the same stuff? I don't understand this. Why aren't we talking to other people that have different ideas? Because we're all talking to each other, right? So I think my concern with agility is in those 2 areas. It's how do we have processes that enable us to do the kinds of things that we're talking about. But I have a bigger concern with how do we have agility of thought beyond the community where we all just talk to each other.
Did you have an answer for that, or you just...
No, I'm here to raise questions.
Okay, fair enough.
No, but actually, to follow up on that, I think part of it is, so I was talking to a friend of mine, he's at one of the larger corporations, and he's actually challenged his chief scientist not to interact with some of the same people, and to actually try to figure out, okay, what else is different? Right? So I remember I was reading a bunch of these articles about what are the most concerning technologies, and they're all the same. Then all of a sudden, something different came up. Blockchain. That was new. It's like, I hadn't seen that before. And that was exciting, right? Something new. But now blockchain's on that list, and nothing else has changed. So then I was talking to a friend of mine, I said, what if time travel just popped up, right? What if someone could do, that would be disruptive, right? Of course, they just laughed at me. But then the next day I saw something in Physics Review that said some mathematicians had found ways to prove the mathematics of time travel. Right. Okay. We realize that's over the top. But the point is, there are other things out there that we should be paying attention to, but we don't know we should be paying attention to. And I think it's really a matter of just getting out of our comfort zone of what we're reading, who we're talking to, and seeing the other things that are out there, right? I mean, Andy was talking about going to CES. We went to CES, Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. And we went out there not just to see what was out there, but we also took college students with us to get a different viewpoint. So I think part of it is seeing different stuff, but the other perspective is getting a different viewpoint. And we asked the college students to come back and say, of what you saw, and we, oh, by the way, we gave them a kind of a tutorial on our mission set. What do you think we should be concerned about based on what you saw? And they came back with stuff none of us even thought about. I was like, oh, that is scary, but I hadn't thought about that, right? So I think there is an answer. But all of us, the folks in this room, et cetera, have to get out of our comfort zone of what we're reading and who we're talking to.
That's good, thanks. Something that's come up that each of you kind of touched on a little bit is that sometimes the solution might be more limited fielding of technology, whether it's prototyping or not fielding across the whole force in terms of scale, or something that's short in time that you use for a short period of time. Obviously, that's sort of anathema to DoD's culture, right? If we're going to buy something, we want to buy it in scale so that we get cost savings, but also field it across the whole force so that we're getting, we don't have sort of mismatched different systems and then we're dealing with logistical problems. I'd just be interested in kind of each of your thoughts on how we deal with the bureaucratic challenges that come with that. How do we kind of overcome some of those obstacles? Either of you could jump in, however you...
I'm glad you first put it in.
Well, I'll speculate that most of the consumer marketplace has solved this problem already. I don't worry that the iPhone I buy in New Hampshire is going to be substantially different from the iPhone I buy in Texas, right? So there is a certain uniformity that comes with scale, and we shouldn't fear it, right? The problem is that the military often imposes sets of other regulatory hindrances on the things that we buy, and those we ought to evaluate. We ought to be free to look at them and say, that regulation really was important in 1972 when it first came on the books. Maybe it doesn't matter anymore. I'll give an example of a project I've been recently looking into. We have a young helicopter pilot join DIUX, and the first thing he said was, what I and all my buddies want is a better helmet. The helmets we wear right now, they are so heavy, they hurt my neck, they hurt our back, and even if we're not actually, all we're doing is training, we're in pain at the end of a day of wearing the helmets. So we looked a little bit, well, where did the requirements come from? How heavy are they allowed to be? Turns out 4 cadavers in 1963 at Wayne State University led to everything we know about how much impact force a helmet should withstand. By the way, who's got the best data right now on what the brain can or cannot tolerate in terms of impact? Anybody guess? NFL, right? Time to look and say, update those things. So we ought to be wary of regulations that somehow conflict with our own common sense. We ought to feel free to question them. And as we develop new ones, and I don't mean to not be rigorous and mindful of how important they are, but they aren't engraved or chiseled in stone anywhere.
Yeah, great point, Bernadette. Too often in our current system, cost, performance, and schedule are all metrics that we're looking at as we go forward into an acquisition cycle or into an acquisition process of acquiring something. But what we very rarely do is at the end of the, at FOC, when the whole Army's been fielded or the whole Air Force has it, do we then take a look backwards and evaluate how successful that was? I mentioned earlier that there's nothing more expensive than fully fielding something that we can't use because it's either been supplanted by technology or we've moved forward. But we very rarely look back and say, the B-58 Hustler was just money sunk. And for those of you who don't know, that was a 4-engine Mach 2 capable, supersonic bomber that preceded the B-1. And the only reason I use it as an Army guy, I'm not picking on the Air Force, but I had a professor once who was a B-58 Hustler navigator, and he told all kinds of great stories about that plane that was only in the inventory for 10 years and was never used. So So, like I said, nothing is more expensive than a fielding effort that is not used. I think some of the things that I mentioned in the controlling the clock and manufacturing process can help aid in the expense of having multiple different kinds of equipment in the field. And if we're looking at a portfolio of, transporting soldiers around the battlefield, it may be Bradleys, it may be MRAPs, it may be the LMTV, JLTV, and hopefully in the future we get to, hoverboards and ultimately teleportation. But regardless of how we move soldiers around the battlefield, if we had the type of factory that we're talking about in the future, component production becomes much quicker, much faster, and it can produce any component for any of those systems that we would have. But point taken, Paul, it is an issue that we would have to tackle.
Yeah, I have to go back to what Bernadette said about the requirements, regulations. So here's an example. The Army had a program called Connected Soldier for Digital Applications, CSDA. And I got involved in that early on. And the goal of that program was to bring iPhones, Android phones to the Army. Sounded like a great idea. And the whole idea was that, you know how cheap these things are. Why can't the Army use those instead of a very expensive soldier radio or something like that? That was kind of cool. Made sense. All of a sudden you start getting into these requirements. Security. The fact that there's no infrastructure in a lot of these austere environments where they operate. So now you have to have mobile cell systems. And you start realizing that because of the way that the military does its job, a lot of these things aren't exactly applicable. So I think then the question becomes, how do you reduce some of those requirements? Because if you go to a different model, let's take a different model, let's take space. So you go from the exquisite type of platforms that are currently fielded to now start looking at how do you get those kind of capabilities with some of the commercial satellites. That's a whole different model, right? Instead of a 20 to 30 year model, where by the time these things, the exquisite systems are deorbited, the technology is 20 years old or so, or older. Now you've got more of a cell phone model where these things are deorbited every 18 months or so, right? But now you have to have a different way of operating, because now instead of having one really great sensor, you've got to have some way of having a distributed aperture to get the same kind of resolution, right? So now there are other issues, timing and things like that. The same thing is true with the phone issue, is how do we manage to take these things that we all use, that everyone's used to using, change the way we do things in a way that's consistent with getting the mission accomplished, but it's also consistent with using the technology. And what I've seen happen has been, instead of the ConOps changing and requirements changing with what's available, we try to jam everything into the existing ConOps and regulations. And the commercial technology is just not meant for that. And until I think we're ready to co-develop the ConOps with and use the commercial technology, there's going to be a fundamental mismatch.
So given, each of you, Dr. Brothers, and you, Dr. Johnson, talked about some of these examples. We have a lot of commercial tech that needs to be innovated, sort of adapted in some way to bring it into force. How do we think about when we're making investments in government, whether in DoD or other parts of the national security space, where the government should be investing in technology versus waiting and letting the private sector do something and then draw that in, versus maybe adapting it in some way? How do you balance kind of those needs?
Well, there are, in fact, military requirements that are almost uniquely military. For example, if I want, in the medical domain, I want field-forward diagnostic equipment. I'd like a handheld portable MRI. I need rapid triage and traumatic surgery kind of tools and implementations. The commercial sector is not really going for those markets, right? There's not a really big demand. So identify those places that are, in fact, uniquely military. And while there is, in fact, a sort of a science and entertainment aspect to subs, I would say largely they're staying part of the military arsenal. In terms of how we actually exploit commercial technologies, I will agree, and I think this was the point you were making, Reggie, that it's not all just ready to take off the shelf. There are actually real problems sometimes in the adaptation. But most of the time what we find we're asking is, we want the capability when, let's say you're a deployed soldier, I want the capability on the field that I have at home. It's not that they want some magical, mystical, dream-like, futuristic teleportation, although I think we all have agreed here we would like that. What they really don't want to be is depowered compared to what they are in their normal home life. So whether the military starts investing in ruggedized, militarized versions of commercial technology, that would be one option, and that goes for software, by the way. very explicitly. Or the commercial sector realizes that there is money to be made in also servicing this market and does so. That would be another way.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure how much more I can add to that, quite frankly. I think that Bernie's right. There's certain things that are fundamental to DoD that the commercial world is not going to invest in. I think there are areas of science that should be invested in that the commercial world is not going to be invested in. If you look at the investment curve of industry and government over the past decades, about 1980 you find this inflection point where, from an applied research perspective, industry started spending more. Right? Started spending more. So that means that you've got a big spend now in industry that's not going to what the government used to spend in. So we've got to figure out how do we leverage that. But then, even though the spend has decreased and the gaps widened over time, we still have to figure out what are the fundamental areas that only we are concerned with. And this is across fields, right? It's not just physics fields, it's also the biological sciences as well. And it's not clear to me that we've actually made that definition yet. But I think it's something we really do have to make. Because so for example, we had a conversation earlier about the laboratories, government laboratories. Let's say the government laboratory is doing some of the same things that commercial industry is doing. Is that a good idea? Well, I'm not sure. It depends on what it is. But there's not enough, we talked about this earlier, enough communication going back and forth from the commercial world to, let's say, the DoD laboratories to say, okay, this is really something, the DoD laboratories can make a breakthrough in this. The commercial world's not really doing this. That would be a good thing to do. But that type of bidding of stuff, I personally haven't seen yet.
So I think I see a lot of familiar faces in the crowd here. We've got a lot of folks who probably could be up here around the panel. So I'd like to open up to Q&A from the audience. And for those watching online, we'll also take questions on Twitter on using hashtag #InnovateTheForce. So we should have somebody in the back with a microphone. If you want to ask a question, just raise your hand. Yeah. And we'll go ahead and just wait for the microphone so they can pick you up on the live stream. Oh, if you could please, when you ask a question, just say very quickly who you are, where you're from.
My name is Allie, and my microphone is off, so I'm just going to do it without a microphone.
Is it?
Sorry.
Just talk into
I've
it.
been lucky enough to work for everything from GIATO to DITRA to currently DARPA. One of the things that was common across all what we were saying was the issue of time. And how do we deal with time? And then the other thing is stovepipes was the other common thing that I heard a lot of. And the difference between private sector and public sector, I think, has become blurred. We have something called the FAR, and also the idea of talent acquisition. How do we deal with those issues? I love the concept of colorless money, by the way. I'm a huge fan of it. But if you could address issues related to the FAR, and what you said so brilliantly, looking at some of the regulations we have, which actually basically put handcuffs on us. Thanks.
So I'll tackle that briefly, but I know you have opinions also. So the FAR is there for a reason, right? It evolved over time. It probably, I'm going to guess, at one point was only a few pages long.
Yep.
Let's just imagine that time in the Jurassic era. One of the things that we've been able to do at DIUX, which may sound innovative but is, sort of embarrassingly simple, is leverage an alternate acquisition method called the Other Transactional Authority. It's been on the books also for years, and it's a mechanism for bringing small companies or non-traditional companies on contracts quickly. This is not earth-shattering, highly amazing invention, but the fact is this has been there, seldom used. We're using it to great effect. I know DHS is. Does the FAR need an overhaul? Sure. Does anyone in the room want to get started on that? I don't know. We'll chalk that up to the U.S. Digital Service and see if we can get them involved. Do you have some thoughts?
I think you handled that part. Let me go back to your time thing for a second. I think one of the challenges right now is time is becoming increasingly important. So it used to be a time when we developed a technology, and we had maybe 10 years to counter that technology. Right? We don't have that longer. Right? So now we have a situation where a technology comes out, we have to develop a counter to it immediately. So and it could be commercial technology, right? So let's take drones. So at SOFIC that's going on right now, a gentleman made a comment that one of the biggest challenges they had was ISIS was using drones. Right? Well, drone technology just started really coming out a couple of years ago, and is in the commercial world. But yet we've got to quickly ramp up and figure out how do we do a counter-drone effort. But now we get the intersection of not just tech, but also law and policy, right? So now now it's even more confusing. Because in some ways, I'd argue that where innovation was at the intersection of tech and markets, is now at the intersection of tech, markets, law, and policy. And ethics falls in there as well, right? So it becomes a much harder thing. And one more comment on speed. One thing I learned at DoD and DHS, one of the biggest challenges to decision makers is the speed at which they can make a decision. Right? So when I went to, when I was in DHS, I talked to the administrator of FEMA. He said his biggest challenge was, how do I determine when to tell people to shelter in place or to evacuate? His biggest concern was, how do I move that decision to the left? Chief of Staff of the Air Force gives a speech where he talks about warfare of the future is going to be imposing multiple dilemmas from multiple modes on the enemy. Okay, if that's true, which makes sense, then that goes in this whole decision speed piece. So a lot of the things that I think we have to be developing have to do with how do we increase the speed and the accuracy and precision of our decision makers. But again, the FAR issues, I talked to someone on the Hill and he said, you know, DoD's got all the authorities it really needs. It just has to use them. And OTA is I think, one of those things where it's just not used enough, and people have to be more creative with those kind of vehicles.
The last thing that you brought up was the colorless money. I think the challenge would be, and especially coming from a DARPA point of view, I would hate to go along with an assumption that money would flow from the big pots to the little pots if it was colorless money. There's a reason why Secretary McNamara, started the major funds programs, right? Because he couldn't get the investment in the strategic nuclear triad that he wanted when he left it up to the services. And there's also a reason why we had to have the Nunn-Cohen Amendment to Goldwater-Nichols, because SOCOM would have died on the vine if it would have been left to the services to fund SOCOM, right? So that would be my one bit of hesitation to colorless money, is it may not have the effect that we would desire, especially in science and technology research and engineering.
Yes, there's a mic coming to you. Okay.
Hi, I'm Joy Purser. I'm at OSD Cape. In June, I'll detail to OMB to become the Defense Science and Technology Examiner at OMB. My question is about termination of programs. So Cape often deals with the acquisition process, and I've never witnessed a program manager rewarded for terminating his or her own programs. So in industry, it's something that companies do a lot. They throw a lot of money at early stage projects, and then the ones that don't do well are brutally terminated as early in the process as possible. So what are your thoughts on how we can change either the acquisition or other policy processes at agencies to more emulate that concept?
Was it Jill?
Joy.
Oh, Joy. I think Joy must be holding my wallet because I paid her for that question. But I will tell you, it was one of the things that became readily apparent to us too, as we looked at the portfolio of real options. You're exactly right. Program managers are assessed individually by their program, and they're assessed, as we've already discussed, on cost, performance, and schedule. And there is nobody who would voluntarily say, you know what, I've been over to DARPA, I've seen what DARPA is working on, and my program is really obsolete. We should kill this. One of the things we advocated for in the paper we wrote was that we should assess acquisition programs at the portfolio level and not at the program level. And I think what that would do is that would get at what you're talking about in terms of willingness to internally kill a program. I mean, the one example that I can think of recent was the Army, and I think it was specifically attributed to General Cody when he was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, was killing the Comanche, right? Unlike the F-22 that took the Secretary of Defense and everything else, I mean, that was an internal Army decision. And the Army actually reaped huge benefits from canceling that program. The ability to take money that was in the POM and reprogram it to recapitalize the entire fleet, buy the LUH-72 and everything else. So the portfolio level analysis would help with that. And I think that there are two ways. There's the default would be categorically, right? People would want to default to just looking at, well, instead of calling it the Program Executive Office Aviation down in Huntsville, right? We would just call it the Portfolio Executive Office, and we would look at all the helicopters in the Army. When really, you would almost, instead of doing it categorically, you should do it by capability. And so the portfolio, for example, if you want to take a look at the Apache shouldn't be compared against the Black Hawk, the Chinook, and everything else. It should be compared against the Javelin missile, the M1A1, the A-10, and all the other anti-tank weaponry out there, because then we could really see, hey, so we would be able to assess. The Air Force wants to, retire the A-10. Well, can the F-35 adequately pick up the slack left behind by that tank killer, leaving the airspace above us? And if not, what changes do we want to make to the, blocky Apache or to the M1A1 or to, force development, and how maybe we field more Javelin missiles, right, to more infantry units. I mean, about all those things. But we couldn't agree with you more. And I think that we need to kind of break that paradigm. And, and if we look at the portfolio level, we could get away from, programs being sacred cows and unable to kill.
One thing I'd add to that is the importance of leadership, whether it's service level, as you mentioned, or secretary level, to make those hard decisions. Secretary Gates clearly did that, swung an axe to a lot of major programs. I think it's worth pointing out now we have a Secretary of Defense in office today who, as a military commander, actually took a role in terminating his own organization, right, at JIFCOM. I mean, that's like the ultimate anti-bureaucrat. I don't know who does that. So that's encouraging, I think, in terms of someone who's willing to make those tough decisions. Yes, let's, Amy, could you hit James and then TX?
Thanks. Is this working? Okay,
Yeah,
thanks. I'm Jim Hassick. I'm from the Atlantic Council. I study a lot of issues in military technology, but I want to ask you about, any of the three of you, about things other than technology. There are other ways to innovate. I think about historically, if we think about Gustavus Adolphus or Frederick the Great or Napoleon, these were very innovative military leaders, but what they did was not technological. It was tactical and organizational and even drawing on changes in society. So tell me what you can think of that the U.S. military is not doing that maybe ought to be doing organizationally. What are we missing?
But let me start. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but let me give you a perspective I learned. National Academies of Sciences did a study. They asked me to be on a study for the soldier as a decisive weapon. And the thesis behind the question, the charter of the committee, was that the Navy and Air Force have decisive weapon systems, right? Clearly decisive weapon systems, air power, sea power, these kinds of things. But the Army squad, which is the fundamental unit, wasn't thought of as decisive. So the idea was that the Academy should come up with some ideas of how to make the squad decisive in some sense of the word. We divided the team into two different parts. One part was a material dimension, tech. The other was a human dimension. And so I led the tech dimension. And of course, being a technologist, my thought was, yeah, of course, tech is the answer to all these things. It was quite an education for me. We went to each other's briefings, and all of a sudden I learned the importance of leadership and training, doctrine, these kinds of things. And at the end of the day, that's what was making the squad decisive. I mean, the technology can enable them to do certain things, but there was that leadership piece, the training piece, that from our perspective in the Academy, that's what made them decisive. Now, I can't tell you what the Army's not doing right now, but I can tell you from our perspective, that was the human dimension was the most important piece of that.
I think TX had a question.
Well, and while the microphone's coming around, I think one other aspect of that may be a good news story is, as the Army develops the advise and assist brigades, one of the things they're looking at is the flexibility that those brigades give to the Army. We talk about limited fielding. I mean, what a great example of a brigade to give a piece of kit to, that you might want to give it in limited numbers to see how they employ it, how it works in the battlefield. Can a soldier break it? How quickly can a soldier break it? How quickly can we fix it and return it to him or her? The other thing that I think is another part of that is the Army recognizes the adaptability of an advise and assist brigade to be changed into a capability that may be needed in the future that is yet to be unforeseen. So I think that you're hitting on a great point, that it's not just tech focused, that we need to look at the structure of our commands, the structure of our basic building blocks, the squads, the capabilities we give them. And I think that we're doing that. Probably not enough, but we are doing it.
Maybe, could you explain maybe for folks who are not familiar with, either here in the live stream, because this is a pretty new innovation for the Army, what the Advised Assist Brigade is, and then what its possibilities are in terms of being used as kind of the seed for something in the future that could grow into a...
Sure. So if in brevity, SOCOM's really had the market cornered on a lot of the advise and assist, the security force assistance, the foreign internal defense type missions, and with our Green Berets, I mean, that was kind of their bread and butter. The mission grew to such a size in both Iraq and Afghanistan and some other countries around the globe, and that we needed to apply the general purpose force to foreign internal defense and security force assistance, these advise and assist type missions. The other logical step in making that transition was the advice that in the assistance we were giving was not special operations specific. So it made sense that if we're training basic infantrymen or mech infantry type tasks, field artillery, whatever it is, that our soldiers from the BCTs could perform those missions. It was a drain on the Army. It consumed a ton of manpower. It put the BCTs in a constant kind of a turmoil as to what their identity was and what we were using them for. And so the Army has the concept now of creating a couple of advise and assist brigades that will be their primary mission. I think there's anytime you bring something like that up, people start talking about it's almost like tiered readiness with the haves and the have-nots and things like that. But by active personnel management, you'll keep the force from becoming stagnant in an advise and assist type role. I mean, it'll be, you put a soldier in for one tour, and then you move him back to an ABCT, an IBCT, or wherever his or her core function resided.
Let me add one thing interesting. It's not just, there's tech involved, but there's work going on in OSD right now to fund research into how warfighters should work with machines better. This is the whole AI piece, right? So you got the so-called centaur model, right, where humans are working with machines. And over time, the thesis is that the machines will be making more decisions. The limit of those decisions will be some kind of policy or ethics kind of floor. And over that period of time, humans have to figure out how do you work best with the machines. So there's a lot of work going on right now that I think is very innovative of how best humans should work with these machines and where that Venn diagrammatic overlap really is and how that evolves over time.
TX.
TX Hamilton National Defense University. We've talked about innovation, but we haven't really talked about going from innovation to application. And very often innovation goes wrong. When we look at the period between World War I and World War II, air power was clearly going to be a big innovation. But each service did it, and each kind of did it wrong. The Navy now brags about carrier air in World War II, but they were planning to fight with battleships, and that's what they bought. The Japanese did us the courtesy of sinking the battleships and got that idea out of their head. The Army Air Corps had a different problem. They thought air power and thought heavy bombers. The bomber will always get through, and it wasn't until Second Schweinfurt they went, oh, wait a minute, maybe we should invest in some long-range fighters. How do we set up the rigorous testing and evaluation that keeps us from going to the biases of the services? I mean, that may be the trickiest part. Because you have the right innovation doesn't mean you get the application right.
So,
We all want to say something, I can tell.
yeah, we've come across this problem as we've looked at modernization, and really, we spent some time looking at disruptive technology, and what we found was, technology isn't really disruptive. It's really disruptive innovation, right? Because it's it's exactly what you said. It's the application of that technology that then proves to be disruptive. We've also looked at Schweinfurt 2 as a case study example with, the up engine of the P-51, the drop tanks, and the ability to then escort our B-17 fleet over there. I think that, and maybe really I should just punt this over to Bernadette, but one of the things we've talked about is, a virtual test range. is really a DoD-sponsored virtual test range that is open to a greater number of competitors. Going back to where the three problems that I said we started with, the first one, in the RDT&E is really limited competition. But if you're doing something on a virtual test range, what you really do is you open up that competition to a lot more players who can come in and take a swing at some of these challenges and some of these ideas. Exactly what you're getting at with, if we can tease out the issues of how we're applying the technology in a system like that, we could apply it better when we actually field it.
So I'm not a military historian, and I don't have the benefit of a lot of the domain knowledge here that my colleagues do. But one thing that has always struck me as someone who's been working to solve DoD problems for close to 30 years is why is it separated the way it is? Why is there a land base and a sea and air? And I know why it started, but why does it still look like that? So let's just assume these institutions are just too tough to kill, but ask ourselves the following thought experiment. What if members of each service rotated through the other ones for periods of time to gain a perspective on what the operational environment was, what the problems, what the capabilities were? I know this is done at some small level, especially in the joint offices, but the truth is, I do believe that part of our problem is a legacy problem of the historical foundation of our independent services. And if we were a fresh, brand new little country standing up today, we wouldn't design the military that we currently have the way we have it. Not when we have so many cross-cutting problems and capabilities from cyber and air and so forth. So, yeah.
You're speaking heresy now.
Yeah,
Cats
I
running
know.
with dogs.
You guys turned the camera off for that. I won't have a job to go back to.
Before, if Reggie has anything to say, as a graduate of the Naval War College,
All right.
I did want to agree with you, though, in the sense, TRADOC is now talking multi-domain battle. And if you think about some of the ideas that General Perkins and his staff are looking at with multi-domain battle, it makes interoperability and jointness all the more important in the future. I think that it also speaks back to the portfolio level management. Why should if we're looking at shore-based anti-ship missiles that are run and managed and employed by the U.S. Army, we need to do that very closely in conjunction with the U.S. Navy in terms of, so how do we look at that cross-domain, for example? Air superiority, right? We always defer to the Air Force and we let them handle that. But there's a whole panoply of ideas in terms of swarming drones, shore ADTHAAD, and things like that are Army-based systems that, maybe we should ensure are interoperable with F-35s before we just cede air superiority to the Air Force, for example.
More questions? All right, I'll take a follow-up on this one. One of these challenges in moving from sort of an innovative idea to actually using it can be cultural bureaucratic obstacles that get in the way, particularly when it's tied to the identity of a service or a subcomponent of a service and how they kind of perceive their core mission. I'm just interested in your thoughts from kind of the roles each of you are playing or have played on. How do we begin to overcome some of those obstacles?
I'm going to defer to Mark and Reggie on that one.
Well,
or wait.
I think DARPA is a great example of a way to overcome, those obstacles. The independence that an organization like DARPA has allows us to explore a lot of different technologies that may not be, in the core interest of a service to explore, right? From parochialism or their desire to preserve a particular domain. But I would offer that's a great way to look at it. I think that with the current NDAA and the split of USD AT&L into R&E and ANS, I think is going to be a challenge for us in the future in terms of how those two undersecretariats work together to bridge the gap from research and engineering to acquisition and sustainment to prevent the exact problem that you teed up in that question.
I think one thing to think about is there's certain military exercises, right? You've got TSOAs, you've got Black Darts, you've got Trident Spectres, you've got these experiments which I distinguish from demonstrations. So I'd argue that a tech demonstration is examples of Army NIE, right, a network integration experiment, where you bring equipment to some place, you know what it's going to do, you try to show it's going to do what you thought, and you hope it does if you're a performer. I contrast that with an experiment. Experiment is where you bring equipment to a place where the actual users are, and these can be joint users, but actually start really co-developing stuff, but working together. And what I've found, having been to these type of events, these kind of experiments, is you start developing these concept of operations that are joint because they're all developing everything at the same time. So I've just seen that be effective. Now that doesn't mean that at a very large strategic scale I've seen that happen, but at a more tactical small unit level, I've seen that be very effective.
And I will just comment too that one of the things that's been really eye-opening for me at DIUX is more than half of the current population of DIUX is military, assigned from every branch of the services together. And when we work in the DIUX environment, there are no uniforms. Everything is first name basis. It takes apparently some getting used to for the guys in uniform, but for the rest of us, it seems perfectly normal. And I think each of them goes away with some understanding from the experience of having served in this very nimble kind of joint capacity. So more of those activities, whether they're demos and fieldings and ATDs and so forth, or just embedded in agencies like DARPA and other places, are positive.
Oh, no, wait, hold on, because we want to be able to pick it up on the ledger. Yeah.
Hey, Jim Raimondo. So a little bit on the innovation, the personnel, and the risk side. So our organizations, military organizations, aren't really good with assuming risks and being innovative, right? Coming up with the 80% solution and then going with that. So I wonder, culturally, some of the things you've seen to maybe overcome that, or how we can, we don't reward those folks, in fact, that are innovative, right, for the most part. So any thoughts you might have on that kind of cultural, personnel, force of the future kind of aspects in promoting that innovative kind of culture?
So I would argue that there's a few very simple things that you can try and probably 100 things that you ought to try. But for example, on a project level basis, every project ought to have an exit strategy defined up front. I don't mean big program or even portfolio level, but when you're starting a project, you ought to know under what condition will I kill this thing, or under what condition should this stop. And that might be some significant milestone, and it might be as simple as, after 3 months, is there anything else that looks better out there now? Whatever. So start integrating that very early on into your whole culture of how you define projects. Another, at the people level, may be rewarding folks for, humorous failures, not ones that hurt anybody, obviously. But like the science community has the Ig Nobel Awards or the Journal of Irreproducible Results. These are poking fun at themselves for essentially, going down a particular path that may not necessarily work out in the end. But it's under the philosophy as if you don't try, or what is it, 100% of the goals you don't try for, you don't hit. I'm going to get that wrong because it's a sports analogy. My apologies. But I think we can learn. There's plenty of those small little things, and after a while, it's just kind of surprising to see, I think, how it spreads through a unit, through a group.
Yeah, I think it was Little Hart who said the only thing harder than getting a new idea into the military mind is getting the old one out, right? And so I think that what you're talking about is somewhat cyclical, and I think we go through periods of innovation and adaptation and change, and then we come back to maybe periods of stagnation. The book that I think about when you ask that question was Prodigal Soldiers, right, which kind of laid out how a generation of officers, kind of the Colin Powell generation, but when they came out of Vietnam, what happened to the Army in the 1980s, how we came across the Big Five, right, which were the Apache, the Black Hawk, the M1, the Bradley, and the Patriot. And I'm not, those, if you look at those as far as programs, may not now in hindsight been that successful, but, through time and maturation proved to be great systems for the Army. But there was great risk, in the 1980s in those changes, in that development, and I think there was a generation of officers that were rewarded for that risk. I think that, and I mean, I have a bias, and so putting the bias aside, but the experience of my 11 years in SOCOM, And SOCOM has the advantage of having unique acquisition authorities and producing on a smaller scale, but you can see examples of rapid innovation at the Special Operations Forces support activity up at Lexington, and through the SOCOM acquisition cycle in terms of both risk and reward. And that can be expanded, I think.
From my perspective, it's a leadership issue, right? Because, for example, when I went to at DHS, one of the challenges we had in S&T was there was a counter-risk culture, right? And how do you have a culture where you can't take risk in an S&T organization? Well, it's back to a lot of things we've already talked about. And the leadership has to be willing to say, if you fail, it's okay as long as it was a reasonable risk you've taken in the first place. And it's a culture change, and it takes time. But it just requires the leadership to be unified around that and people to be incentivized to take those risks and not de-incentivized to fail.
Yeah, I think, go ahead, Andy.
My name's Bruce Parker. I worked as an Army civilian for 38 years, and I'm currently employed by the British Defence Staff at the UK Embassy here in Washington. When you talked about the Big Five, it prompted me to think that the Bradley fighting vehicle, just as one, was much maligned when it first started. But you talk about, I think what you really said, sir, is you said that there was great risk in the beginning, but what you didn't finish was said, but I think the risk was mitigated over time as they continued to work on the platform. But I was wondering, with those Big Five, and I think there's other programs like the Air Force C-5 aircraft, I don't see modernization anymore. I just see future blocks of current programs. And I'd like somebody to just maybe talk about the point of that in itself, I think, is providing risk for the future by not continuing to modernize and innovate and continuing to live off the work that was done previously.
Yeah, I think, typically we talk in terms of either modularity or open architecture in terms of these types of systems. I mean, the B-52 is probably the best case study. I flew the MH-47, and the average age of the fleet while I was flying the MH-47 was about 46 years old, and that was average age. I mean, they were Vietnam Alpha models that had been slept multiple times. And there's an important component of modernization that oftentimes as we've done outreach and we've talked about our ideas, there's criticism in terms of, well, you're advocating delay, and you're advocating not doing anything, and there's risk involved in that. And so I think the difference is that we're not advocating to go back to a pre-Cold War type system where you did not have a standing army, right? Where you focused on a generating force and you built the army for the conflict. I mean, we did that all the way up to World War II. And in fact, we were doing that post-World War II until the Korean conflict and our tensions with the Soviet Union kicked off. So I think that continually upgrading platforms is actually not a bad way of talking about real options, because it's much cheaper to make the C5M model, right, from the A's and the B's than it is to procure a brand new C5. And while we're flying the M model, that's where we take a look at DARPA and commercial industry and everything else. So, and ask them, what is the next generation of cargo aircraft? And I would assume, we would probably default, and we're using some of these systems today that, it may be an unmanned cargo delivery system, or whatever in the future. But simply due to the cost of upgrading all the Chinooks in the Army, or upgrading, completely changing out the fleet of C5s in the Air Force, I think it becomes cost prohibitive, and that's why, the SLEP type programs are so important to us, to allow us to have that capability, the force in being, the deterrence of being able to extend our global reach that no other country can do in the world today, with the systems that we have. There's also some current procurement efforts that are going on that are advocating open architecture, which is also because, and this gets into technological risk, we don't know what sensor we want to hang off of an RC 12, whatever we're going to call the new future utility aircraft or the new ISR platforms. All we know is that we're going to want sensors. We probably want to weaponize it. We probably want emit, sing it, and all kinds of other capabilities on that platform. And so if we create new ISR platforms that are as modular as possible, we give ourselves those options instead of painting ourselves into a corner with federated systems that we can't, that don't allow us the flexibility in the future.
And the other question I wanted to ask very quickly is, and since I'm working for the UK now, we fight as a coalition, but what are we doing innovatively and research-wise to work with our coalition partners? Thank you.
I mean, I can take that from both DoD and DHS. Number of bilateral and multilateral agreements with Five Eyes and other countries to do just what you're saying, to try to coordinate the research. So, for example, there's some countries that perhaps have test facilities that make it easier for us to use their test facilities. Perhaps there are countries that, one thing I tried to do when I was at DHS was try to say, well, look, if some other country, why don't you focus on, we have a joint gap. Why don't you spend your money on this and we'll spend our money on this other thing. I think, frankly, I think the portfolios need to be managed in some ways better, but there is significant work going on with our allies right now.
Prior to the Army War College, I just came from Europe, and I can tell you that interoperability is about the number 2 priority for EUCOM in terms of and the SAC year in particular, General Scaparrotti with the 28 countries that are all NATO members. And to piggyback on what Reggie said, through foreign military sales is another way that we work on interoperability and working with allies and partners. And then lastly, one thing that I thought was really interesting is SHAPE is really trying to get their arms around what Reggie was saying about working closer with allies and partners. So it's not 28 countries that are individually managing their militaries, but there's a look across the entire portfolio where we don't end up where we ended up a couple of years ago, and we realized we had no bridging capability in Europe. And so then it was working with the Brits, the Germans, the Hungarians in terms of, hey, we've depleted a certain capability in this region. We need to bring that back. Can you guys provide NATO, for example, bridging capability? And that was worked out. So.
I think Heather's going to get the last question. Andy, you want to bring the mic? Or was there 2? We'll get Heather and then you, and then we'll wrap things up.
Hi, Heather Roth, Oxford University. So I kind of have a question that I think several audience members kind of touched on, and maybe I can make it a little bit more crisp. And my question is about social science. So I hear a lot of discussion on innovation and technology, but then there's kind of this lurking thing about, how we as humans use technology, how we as humans live in bureaucracies, how we as humans order our lives. And that, to me, is a social science question, right? So I'm wondering how much innovation is happening where you're drawing off of political scientists, sociologists, historians, regional experts, and really embedding them in the innovation process as well, science and technology and society, STS folks, because that seems to me to be maybe where the money might get, right? I mean, you have the technological development, but you actually have to reach across these other disciplines that kind of get ignored and they don't get funded. So what kinds of
let me
ways
touch
to
on
do
that. So I think I mentioned earlier that in DHS we developed these things called integrated product teams, which laid out what the capability gaps were, the mission sets, these kinds of things. I also mentioned that it was laid out in a matrix. So the verticals were the mission sets and the gaps, and the horizontals were these cross-cutting technology areas. One of the cross-cutting technology areas was behavioral sciences and economics. And the reason why we put it there was because when you look across all of the mission sets and capability gaps, it was extremely important to try to understand where the innovations were in those areas and what were some of the challenges. A good example is cybersecurity. Right? I mean, it's a perfect example where the behavior, people say 80% of cyber security is cyber hygiene. Right? That's a behavioral issue. And so we found it essential to actually try to embed social sciences into our research portfolio just for that very reason.
So I can also say that I think this is an area that is growing and will continue to grow, especially as we bring even more disciplines in. One example I might look at is the phrase, probably not even 10 years old, where we look at patterns of life. So once upon a time, the folks who looked at patterns of life were image analysts who were looking at satellite imagery of vehicles moving in and out of an area. Then they got to add to that, oh, I'm going to add some open source information. I'm going to see, how many, friendly Facebook likes and things, how many weddings are happening and so forth. And as we allowed us to expand the amount of data that we were looking for and at, it brought naturally other people into the mixture. So, what does it mean when everyone decides to do the following kind of a thing? Does that predict some kind of instability? And of course, not to mention, you brought the meteorologists in when it looked like there may be been, a climate change related thing. So I think across the board at the individual level, where we have neuroscientists that are helping with training, we have behavioral scientists and cognitive scientists helping with decision support, and we have all kinds of social scientists helping with this general int that we do at large scales. This is a converging field, and I think it's really just going to be an asset as it continues to integrate better.
And also, just to be clear, DoD has these things called communities of interest, and there are on the order of 18 of those, and one of those deals with this. So it is something that's dealt with at the highest levels of DoD.
I want to continue on the HR aspects of innovation talk. All three speakers spoke about incentivization of innovation within the department. Academic institutions, such as MIT, incentivize staff to innovate by allowing them to spin out their own companies, provide incubators, equity sharing agreements. The tactical soldier is highly incentivized to innovate. Their life could be at risk. How do you incentivize innovation for the mid-level bureaucrat here in D.C. or for the staff officer that's back at a COCOM?
So, at a very base level, and I don't mean to sound simplistic, authorizing people, giving people authority over significant decisions in their own career fields is a form of incentivization that I think is very positive. So if a person has a good idea, but they don't believe that A, they are empowered to express it, or that if they do, they will get in anything but trouble, that's a bad way to run an organization, and we have to kind of get away from, I think that has happened, not just in the DoD, but government bureaucracy as a whole. There are other incentivizations, though, that are really working, and I think we can point to them. For example, support, money in the forms of educational support. So the fact that you can have a job and go to night school compliments of your employer. These are very positive. Obviously, all of the things relating to our personal life are good. Good incentives for the government employee as well. But I think in terms of incentivizing innovation, it's really a combination of let it happen, reward it, provided it wasn't illegal or harmful, and learn from it if possible, and spread the gospel as much as you can. And people will, I think this has a way of just spreading rather virally through a population when done properly. That's perhaps simplistic, but those are the really basic elements of what we can do to start empowering it.
I think, Reggie's brought up leadership on a couple of different occasions, and I think, there's great examples of staff officers who have been fantastic innovators. Colonel Warden from the Air Force is highly quoted. In fact, he was quoted in CNAS's publication of Future Foundry, right? So the other example I would give you, a more recent one, is counterinsurgency. From what I experienced in both Afghanistan and Iraq, the tactics and the innovation permeated from the bottom up as much as they were driven by General Petraeus and the rewriting of FM 3-24. And so, one of them gets a lot of splash in the headlines and a lot of credit, and he deserves it. But just know that, we changed on the ground because of the most junior soldiers who saw what was happening and saw how to do things, different, better, and that spread throughout the force.
One thing I'd add is another book. General McChrystal wrote the book Team of Teams, and he talks about communicate till it hurts, and how he brought together all the different elements of the military apparatus trying to work in Afghanistan and Iraq. And by empowering people, mid-level, lower level on up, you can see the kind of results by that kind of communication and empowerment.
We're about out of time, but I want to give each of you a chance to offer any parting thoughts you have on how DoD can be more innovative in the future to adapt to some of these challenges?
So we've had a lot of discussion around the role of technology and innovation, and that's really the first place I go when I start thinking about being innovative, and that just is the bubble I live in. But I really do want to point out that it's none of this works if the policy and regulatory environment are not consistent or supportive of innovation. And so I think it's important, even though I may want to have the next widget, that I be allowed to use it, and I'll just kind of emphasize that again.
Thanks. Well, I would say the one thing, and we've talked a lot about risk. One of the areas of risk that we spent quite a bit of time on was we took a look at systematic risks, right? So not something that would affect just one asset within the portfolio, but that might be portfolio wide. Threats that would potentially take a look or that would threaten command and control, GPS satellite, constellation, things like that would affect an entire range of our options, I think are the real, we've talked about disruptive technology, lower barriers, of entry into drone warfare, cyber warfare, things like that. I think those are those are kind of those nuggets that I would, and that I've taken away from the work that I did at the Army War College, where, a portfolio of real options is not a bunch of manned fighter aircraft right over our skies. It's manned fighter aircraft, it's remote piloted aircraft, it's autonomous drones, it's SHORAD, THAAD, it's electromagnetic pulse weapons, it's whatever. And so those are as we look at the future, and especially the long range, 20 to 50 years, I think that's really why, we came up with that philosophy of a strategy of real options. And that's what I think we should always be watching for, over our shoulders.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of what I was mentioning before. It's the groupthink. I'm just really concerned about that. I think if DoD and the rest of the government can start thinking outside of what we normally think about and talk to different people, it'll enable us, if we have the processes that we've been talking about earlier, to allow that, to be much more innovative and agile.
Okay, good. Well, I want to thank each of you for your insights and expertise, and thank you all for coming today. Thanks very much.